Let's begin by remembering what the Buddha taught. When the Buddha first taught, he taught what is commonly referred to now as the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path, as part of the Four Noble Truths. And these Four Noble Truths, for many Buddhists, are the main trunk of teaching. We are practitioners of Vajrayana Buddhism, and so for us there are three turnings of the wheel. And the three turnings of the wheel, or the three main teachings, are developmental in that they build one on top of the other. And while one doesn't change the other, the emphasis and direction to some degree are deepened, and there is some difference in what is accentuated. But this first turning of the wheel for all kinds of Buddhists is considered to be the trunk of the tree, or the root, really, of our practice. The Four Noble Truths are not separate. They are quite interrelated in that one builds upon the other. But the main thrust, the main idea of the Four Noble Truths is that Lord Buddha teaches us that all sentient beings are suffering, that they are suffering because of desire, that there is a cessation of suffering, and that cessation of suffering is the same as or synonymous with the cessation of desire, and that cessation of suffering is called enlightenment. And the fourth noble truth, of course, is the description of the Eightfold Path. Without wanting to go into the Four Noble Truths with any great detail, because that really is not the topic, and you should refer to previous classes to, if you are interested in hearing more about the Four Noble Truths. I would like to speak of this most important revelation that the Buddha taught us and how we might understand it deeply. That revelation is that all suffering, that all sentient beings are suffering, and that all suffering is caused by desire. When we hear that, it is our nature to stand outside of that teaching or that truth, even though it was taught by a fully enlightened Buddha who ought to know something about something. We sort of stand outside of that, and it's our nature to do so, and it's not wrong. A teaching should be reasonable and logical, and should seem practical and useful to us. So we stand outside of that teaching and we say to ourselves, all suffering is caused by desire, and we try to understand that. We try to see how that applies. At first it's difficult to understand, and we don't really know if we fully accept that, because we think that there are some sufferings that are definitely beyond my control. For instance, there are sufferings that I and others in the human race seem to suffer, sufferings of sickness. And it's an affliction. It seems to come from outside of us, and it seems to happen to us against our will, and it seems unconnected to what we want or don't want, whether we want to get well or don't want to get well. It seems that we have these sicknesses, and we suffer from old age, and we suffer from death, and we suffer from the loss of a loved one, and that happens from outside, and we can't understand how that happened to us. And we suffer from poverty, and we suffer from loneliness, and all of these different things. Then we get to thinking about this a little bit more deeply, and we can sort of see that perhaps the suffering of loneliness is based on desire. That perhaps we are desirous of approval, of company, of comfort, that we are desirous of connection. And that feeling is based on a kind of longing, or perhaps a feeling of incompleteness that we feel needs to be nurtured. There is a neediness there. So even though we don't fully understand this teaching of the Buddha, still we can sort of get maybe something like that. And we can think that maybe the desire for wealth is pretty visible, pretty understandable. Maybe we suffer from poverty because we really have a desire to live in a castle and be a queen or a quick king, or perhaps at least live with all of the modern conveniences and furnishings, and to have freedom, the freedom that only an American Express card buys. And the freedom to be entertained, the freedom to have leisure, the freedom to have an absence of lack. So we can see that that's a desire and that that's a neediness, and perhaps there's some connection there. But no one could fault us, for instance, if we or other human beings, and many human beings are, if we were starving and we naturally needed food to continue. It isn't a question of want, it's a question of need. The body will die without food. And if it were cold and we had no shelter, no one would think it unreasonable that we needed shelter. The body needs clothing and shelter to keep warm. So we just wonder whether there's really a righteous teaching there, whether it really is it really about desire? Or are there some things that you just really do need and that we just don't have, and it's simply not our fault? Well, according to the Buddha's teaching, things apparently are not what they seem to be. And according to the Buddha's teaching, we actually experience the sufferings of loneliness, the sufferings of poverty, the sufferings of hunger, the sufferings of lack of all kinds, and the sufferings of heat and cold, and all of an old age and sickness, and even death. Not because these events occur from the outside and occur in such a way that they happen to us from some uncontrollable or unforeseeable source, but rather, according to the Buddha's teaching, all sentient beings suffer according to their karma, according to a series of cause and effect relationships that they have built up over time. And of course, we have no knowledge of that. Perhaps someone might kill me. And according to the Buddha's teaching, that would indicate that in the past I have killed someone. Of course, I forget that I've eaten meat. But even if I didn't eat meat, perhaps I don't remember what my last life is like. And according to the Buddha, we have lived more than once, many more times than once. I can't say for sure what I've done. The Buddha teaches us that we can tell exactly what we've done, or exactly like what the quality of our life was like in the past, and what actions we began by studying our minds, our natures, our habitual tendencies particularly, and our lives at this time. That by studying our habitual tendencies and what we are like, that from that we'll be able to learn a lot about what we were like in the past and what we did, our actions, the cause and effect relationships that we put into expression. So the Buddha teaches us that people that are starving only superficially appear to be suffering from a lack of food. Actually, they are suffering from their karma. And that if one wants to get to the source of that suffering, one has to do something about their karma. That even if you feed them, you do solve the problem temporarily. And of course we should feed them. Make no mistake, there is no part of me that is not saying we should feed the poor. I am saying that we should feed the poor because, first of all, you can't pray for a person or teach a person anything or be of much benefit to them if they are starving. But to be of any lasting benefit, we have to cut the suffering off at the source. We have to change the karma of the situation. After feeding the hungry, after doing what we can to alleviate suffering in all temporary ways, then we must also do something about the deep problem, the deepest problem, the root of the problem. And so looking at the root of the problem, we try to understand more deeply. Now here's where the Buddha's philosophy must be understood in order to go much further. Because once you uncover desire as the culprit, desire is very hard to understand. If you simply run around trying to force yourself not to feel desire or to quell desire within you, if you simply try to not do anything that will bring about cause and effect relationships, it's like you're trying to apply a Band-Aid to an ulcer. Underneath the thing just festers. And there really is no cure. In fact, it may get worse. That's the nature of the beast. We tend to fester a lot when we apply superficial bandages. So we have to begin to try to understand ourselves. And the Buddha taught a very extensive psychology. He taught a psychology that really doesn't match with the psychology that we learn about in our textbooks today. Well, it has some similarities. There are some structures which are quite similar. And yet there are many things that are quite different in that today's psychology describes a person that began at the time of birth and ends at the time of death. An ego structure that has, at the outside, 100 years to its name. It describes a series of cause and effects that are, according to the Buddha's view, extremely limited and insufficient. The Buddhist psychology, however, goes much further than that. It does not depict a superficial neuroses and isolate it and try to deal with it. For instance, if one were to examine today's psychology, we would think that many of our problems occurred because of the programming that our parents gave us. The Buddha doesn't address that at all, simply because, according to the Buddhist teaching, that's a very superficial psychology. That, in fact, the ego structure we see within ourselves and within other sentient beings does not begin at the time of birth or even at conception, but in fact began at a time unnameable, what the Buddha calls time out of mind, has its roots in antiquity that we simply cannot even comprehend, and has, by the time conception occurs, amazingly profound and ingrained habitual tendencies that are so worked in, so profound, that the ego spontaneously, and I say that tongue-in-cheek, begins to develop in a recognizable, common, ordinary way. And everyone seems to do it in the same way. Begins to develop by showing evidence of its self-awareness. Begins to develop in such a way that self-definition occurs and continues throughout the course of one's life. And the Buddha says that the roots of that actually begin in the deeply ingrained habitual tendency of recognizing self-nature as being inherently real. Now, how does desire fit into all of this? According to the Buddha's teaching, since time out of mind, we have considered the notion of self. Having considered the notion of self from the moment that consideration took place, once the very conception of that idea began to grow or incubate itself, began to develop itself, from that very moment of assumption, there began a process that cannot be separated from the idea of self, and that is the process of definition. You cannot have an idea or an assumption of self without defining self. It is impossible. Try it. Don't take my word for it. Try it. Try having an idea of self without defining self. You can't do it, of course. You can't have any idea, any conceptualization, without defining it. And the continuum of self, obviously, here we are, has been continuing for some time, at least we know, from the time of birth. And according to the Buddhist teaching, that continuum has continued since time out of mind. While the continuum continues, the definition process has to continue, has to keep going, because that is actually what the continuum is made out of. It is only an idea. According to the Buddhist teaching, the experience of self-nature, the assumption of self as being inherently real, is only an idea. According to the Buddhist teaching, we continually experience perception according to that assumption. That in fact all of our perceptual abilities, the five senses, our very consciousness, is an extension of the assumption that self-nature is inherently real. Think about it. What do you experience? Think about your moment-by-moment experience. It is all relative to the perception of self. It is all understood as being the same as or contrasted to the perception of self, the idea of self. Every experience that you have defines self. Every single one. There is no exception. According to the Buddha, one must maintain the definition of self in order for self to exist. And according to the Buddha, we now are in a position of having assumed self to the degree that we cling to the idea of self, thinking that self-nature is our true nature. And it is in fact all that we have ever known. Clinging then begins. This clinging brings about the cause and effect relationships that are associated with desire. Very hard to understand in the beginning. It takes a lot of thinking. I hope that you are willing to really consider this. I don't want you to take my word for it. In fact, it's not my word. This is what the Buddha taught. But I don't even want you to just take it on blind faith. I hope that you will think about it. As Buddhists, we are encouraged to think and think and think and contemplate. We use the technique of contemplation in order to refute the idea of self and see whether we come to the same conclusions as the Buddha came to. And we do that as an antidote also because the idea of self is automatically assumed in every perception, in every thought, in every experience. I hope that you will try that. Now, we wonder about this desire thing, though, and how this works in. I can see, for instance, that I run into trouble when I'm too needy. You can see that, can't you? You don't need me to tell you that. Haven't you noticed that when you run around feeling extremely needy and you really want a lot of things, that your mind is upset because perhaps you can't have everything you want? You learned that when you were a kid and you managed to hold yourself back from jumping up and down on Christmas morning or whatever. You learn to calm yourself, to be more adult about things. But as an adult, we have also learned that when we are really needy, when we are really letting our emotions get away with us, we tend to suffer more. That we tend to have a bit more of a hard time. And we can see that if we absolutely know that during the course of our life we will never have a 10-carat diamond ring, if it looks to us like we'll never have it, or there's a real good chance that we won't have it until we're very old, then it doesn't make sense to us. It seems inconsistent with reality, or sanity anyway, doesn't it? To think, if I don't have a 10-carat diamond ring, I'm going to suffer, always. If we think this way and really cause ourselves to suffer because of it, it seems illogical to do that, doesn't it? It seems kind of insane to do that. So, in our way, we have learned this teaching. But what about the idea that the Buddha presents when he says that all experience that we have now is actually based on desire? That's a hard one to swallow, isn't it? Well, actually, I was thinking about that very thing when I went on a walk the day before yesterday. And I was completely shocked at my own behavior. I learned a lot, and I believe that I perhaps can offer this to you and find it to be, and I hope that you find it to be useful. I was going for a walk, and it was at the C&O Canal. Very beautiful there. The leaves are just starting to change. The air had that rare quality in Washington. It wasn't humid, it was cool, it was crisp. It had rained recently, so that the canal, the water was nice and high. The sky was very blue, hardly any clouds. It smelled good. Pawpaw trees had dropped their fruit, and so the air smelled very fruity. And I was feeling pretty good. So I was really enjoying myself. I was walking and thinking and enjoying myself and having an altogether good time. And I began to watch the nature of my mind, which is a Buddhist practice that we are taught. Well, you don't have to be a Buddhist to do it, but it's a practice that we are taught. I began to watch the perceptual field, examine it, see what I'm seeing, smell what I'm smelling, sense my breath, sense the feelings of my body, and then from that, watch the watcher. Who is smelling? Who is seeing? Who is hearing? Who is feeling? And began to examine the watcher and to watch the watcher watching. And during that process, what one does is one actually begins to refute the different constructs, the artificial construction of self. One watches the watcher and finds that one cannot isolate what that self is, that it seems to be a series of ideas. One cannot locate it. One cannot find where it started. One cannot see where it ends. And it's a fairly complicated technique of beginning to watch the watcher and then refute the reality of self-nature, or rather the experience of self-nature. And after accomplishing this for some period of time, when we become good at this, it seems that we arrive at a place of purer experience. That experience is not based on the idea of self. It doesn't come from self. In other words, self or ego is not the center of that mandala, but rather one experiences instead a pure perception, which is a perception free of the contrivance of self, a relaxed, uncontrived, natural view. And the mind becomes more stable, more relaxed. Perception is pure. So I was doing that to the best of my ability. And I began to have an amazing insight that I think I had noticed before, but somehow it had not become as sharp and meaningful to me ever before. I began to notice that no matter where I am, when I walk down the street or walk down this pathway, every experience that I have, whether it's a wonderful, and I have the capacity for wonderful feelings. We all like to think that about ourselves, don't we? I'm a very deep person. You ever thought that about yourself? I'm really deep. Well, I'm really deep too. You're not deeper than me. So I thought to myself, I have this wonderful sense of how wonderful this is. I can really smell this air. I can really feel this feeling. Wow, I'm really sensitive to how low the humidity is and how wonderful this feels. This feels really great. I'm really enjoying this. How pleasurable this is. how in harmony I am with this, how much like me this clarity is. Do you recognize any of that? Is that or is that not what we do when we walk down the street? If you don't think that's what you do, then maybe you haven't looked close enough, because that is human nature. I find that when we look at the sky and it's blue, we cling to the blue. We like the blue. We accept the blue. The blue is about us. It affects us, and that's what it does for us. When we smell the air, we cling to the smell of air. And isn't there a back door to that thought, that perception of the nice air? Don't we also think, I hate it when it's humid? Don't we also think, I don't like it when things stink? Isn't there a back door to that? When we sense the clarity of autumn air, don't we also think, yeah, but I hate Washington in the summertime when it's heavy and humid? Or don't we also think, yeah, but I like winter better? When you really examine these thoughts, you'll find that at the basis, at the core, at the root of every single perception we have is desire. It's clinging. It's the cement that sticks the whole thing together. Every perception that we have, every single degree of consciousness and perception that we have is cemented with desire. And according to the Buddha, that ego clinging is actually the basis for all suffering. According to the Buddha, it begins a series of cause and effects. The phenomena of attraction and repulsion begins a series of cause and effects that are the basis for suffering of all kinds. Of course, it seems pretty bland. Is that the word I'm looking for? It seems pretty harmless to think if you like the air or not, and whether you like this kind of air or that kind of air. But that longing, that clinging, that phenomena of attraction and repulsion doesn't seem to stop there, because the definition of self continues in those subtle and also in much grosser ways. If it's there, it's there. It's simply there. And if all of our experience has at its root, at its basis, that phenomena of ego clinging, of grasping, according to one's ego, that how much more so are the denser and grosser events of our lives, completely ruled and influenced by clinging, by desire. And so I thought to myself, what do you do with this? It's insidious. I'm trying to be honest with you. I see it in myself. It is insidious. How do you see a blue sky without grasping it? How do you smell clean air without clinging to it? How do you have any kind of experience without defining the self? I'd like to have a clean experience. I'd like to have a clean experience. Listen to it. It's everywhere. So I started to think about the different practices that we do as Buddhists, how they could be applied. The very meditation that I was doing is good because refuting that process puts a space in it. It isn't so knee-jerk. It isn't so automatic. You put a kind of a chink in the system, you know? It's like throwing a monkey wrench into it. That moment of spaciousness can begin a process that leads to supreme liberation. Just that awareness of how we think can begin a process that is precious to us. So I did that for a while. Then I thought to myself, what to do here? And I thought, well, you know, in our very basic preliminary practice, we are taught to do several different practices, 5 different practices, And one of the practices that we do is called mandala offering, in which you actually do a very complicated visualization of the world being transformed into a mandala of offering, into a jeweled mandala, and that jeweled mandala is then offered to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. And it has a very profound meaning, not only a superficial meaning, but also a very profound meaning, in which one understands all of one's perception to be that mandala. And one offers that. And so I thought to myself, that's the ticket, you know. That very basic practice, is that very profound yet basic practice, that is an excellent antidote to apply. That every experience that we have, in order to break the habitual tendency of clinging, in order to break the habitual tendency of self-definition, one can, for instance, experience blue sky. Taste it without clinging. That's possible, you know. Taste it without holding. Taste it without having it define oneself. To fully experience blue sky, and then like a jewel, offer it to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions, and offer it as well to all sentient beings, hoping that the joy of that experience will cause the end of their suffering. To experience food that way, to experience love that way, to experience all of the things that we think make us happy that way. To think of them as transformed into a jeweled mandala, cutting off that clinging at the root, that desire at the root, to experience them as a jeweled mandala, and then from that point offer them to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions, as well as to all sentient beings. It is possible to live and experience without clinging. One's mind then becomes relaxed. Have you ever walked around in your life and thought to yourself that there is always, constantly, an inner tension? It's like an itch. Sometimes you're extremely conscious of it. We are conscious of it. I make no exception for myself. It's a little anxiety, or it's an itch, or it's an impetus to do something. It feels like a tension inside. It's always with us. And yet, if you apply this antidote that I've described, offering the world and all of our perceptions, all of our hopes, all of our fears, all that we are attracted to, all that we are repelled by, and transforming it into a mandala of perfection, offering it to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas of the 10 directions, I have found personally that to be an antidote to that inner tension. And so from that I deduce that that inner tension is desire. That one's mind becomes unstable by the fear that our desires will not be fulfilled. And many of them will not. We know that. We've lived it. And that inner tension is also about another kind of fear. Because some of our desires are fulfilled. And then we fear what will happen to us if they are impermanent, if they end. And so we fear to lose what we have. And we will always lose what we have. It is not possible not to lose what you have. All life experience is impermanent. So this desire, though we all have it, though it's part of us, though it's so foundationally ours, so completely symptomatic of our species and of all sentient beings, there is an antidote. One can apply the antidote. It doesn't have to be accepted dumbly as though we were ox. In order to be motivated to do so, we have to understand something about our psychology, that we have lived with this for a very long time, that it is a deeply ingrained habitual tendency. We have to be willing to accept that, and we have to discover for ourselves, in accordance with the Buddha's teachings, that that desire may in fact be, as the Buddha taught, the cause for all suffering. I have found that to be true, not because I'm such a faithful Buddhist, I hope that I am, but I found it to be true personally, through my own contemplation and examination. And I hope that you will go through that process as well, and examine in the same way. If you come up with the same answer, then you may not know what the antidote is. You may say, well, okay, now I discovered that desire is the cause of all suffering. We have no way of knowing that the cessation of desire is called enlightenment. We've never experienced enlightenment. We have no way of knowing if, in fact, suffering ceases when desire ceases. But the Buddha taught that. And the Buddha taught the first part also, which is the part we found out to be true, that desire causes suffering. So I think it's safe, since he did attain this state beyond suffering, to assume that he knew what he was talking about, and to assume that this is the antidote. So I hope that you will try it. I hope that you will explore these teachings, contemplate them for yourself, and see what you can do with them. They're very reasonable, very logical, and they're not so far from us as to be an unprovable theology. They are about us, and they are easily applied. So I hope that you will think about this, and I most of all hope that you will use it, and most of all hope that it proves to be useful to you, and wish to thank you very much for listening patiently today.
No.